Okay, welcome back, and let's bring in Carlos and Victoire. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So again, for those who've just joined, my name is Lena Slachmuijlder. I co-chair the Council on Tech and Social Cohesion and advise on digital peace building with Search for Common Ground and collaborate with the USC Neely Center. And when polarization pays, fixing the incentives behind social media, this title is not an accident. It reflects a very uncomfortable and yet important truth that the polarization that we're experiencing online is not an accident. It's often a feature of the social media platforms. The engagement driven revenue creates incentives that reward outrage, conflict, and sensationalism. And it's part of the architecture. And what we're learning increasingly is that this is not just about individual people trying to game the system. It's becoming industrialized, automated, scalable, and in some cases, even a business model that can be packaged and sold. So the two guests that we have today are really at the forefront of investigating exactly how this works. Carlos Hernández-Echevarría is the Associate Director and Head of Public Policy at Fundación Maldita, one of Spain's leading fact-checking and information integrity organizations. And Victoire Rio is the founder and executive director of What to Fix, a nonprofit that has done some of the most rigorous work anywhere on social media monetization and its real world consequences, particularly when we're talking about polarization and violence. What I'm going to do is give each of them about 10 minutes to share what some of their findings have been, and then we'll open it up. So Carlos, let's start with you.
Thanks a lot, Lena, and thanks to the Council of Non-Technology and Social Cohesion for the kind invitation to talk today. I'm only sorry I cannot be there in Bishek because these things tend to work better when we are live. Let me show you a little bit of how our work intersects with the theme we are discussing today. And I think Lena was exactly right when she was defining that most of the things we don't like about the societal effects of social media, many of the things that are basically behind these ideas of should we ban social media, should we create public social media, should we prohibit teenagers from being online, all these questions come from this idea that it is not an accident what we are living through. So let me see the next slide and tell you a little bit about those incentives that I see behind the current state of social media and their terrible, terrible consequences for really social cohesion. Can I see the next slide, please? Okay, just to give you a very brief example of an investigation we did. TikTok polarization industry making money off this information with AI-generated videos of protests. I'm going to highlight a few things just to give you an idea of, as Lena was saying, how much of an industry this is. This is partly certainly people gaming the system, but it has reached a scale in which mass manipulation for profit, it's becoming a huge part of this. And nobody can object to people trying to make a buck, but the consequences are dire for all of us, right? So here we have around 500 TikTok accounts that are basically creating with generative AI videos of super emotional political protests that never ever happened, or maybe they did happen in Iran, for example, but there was no footage of it. So there is this group of accounts that is, taking advantage of our feelings when we see these things to promote and get eyeballs. Why they do that? Because they can make money off, in this case, TikTok, because they generate a lot of engagement. In this particular case, it was 89 million views created, concentrated in 5,000, almost 6,000 AI-generated videos from 500 accounts. And if you think this is just a particular thing, let me tell you that the industry component of it is that there were a bunch of people creating, because many of the actors were actually running several, even dozens of different accounts. And their whole purpose was to make money. That's why they were doing this about 18 different countries. They were convincing you that these huge protests were taking place in 18 different countries for 18 different reasons most of the time. Why they do it? Well, they told us themselves. They told us, in plain words, because we post as, people interested in maybe buying the accounts, which is concerning because these people is growing accounts and then they're up for sale. And try to imagine, during an election, what you can do with this kind of account on steroids when you can purchase it, but not a lot of money. But what the creators themselves told us is like, we don't really care about this information, political protest, emotional content, whatever. It's just that we are trying to reach 10,000 followers in order to be able to monetize from TikTok. And what we have seen through experience that works better for TikTok to provide us with that kind of amplification that we need to reach that audience that leads to money is this kind of content, emotional, political disinformation. So these guys that we talked to, trust me, they were all business in this particular case. They were interested in finding the quickest route to reaching a number of followers that allow them to monetize, to earn money from TikTok. So in that case, if you tell them that they need to share positive messages, factual information about whatever, they could do that. It's just that the incentive that the platform is creating for them to reach a particular audience that empowers them to make money is this information. Nothing works as well, in the words of these people. Is this just a one-off? It is not. If I can see the next slide, you can see that this doesn't limit itself to one platform. Far from it. This is another investigation by Maldita. Verified scams, how Meta's blue check mark legitimizes 67,000 fraudulent ads. In this case, these people is actually using Meta's infrastructure, the ad system, to scam people time and time again. What we saw is in Europe, and I'm focusing in Europe because that's where we could get the data, and we need to have serious conversations about data access, because sometimes many of these studies we do in Europe because that's the only place where we can get the data, which is probably a separate conversation. But in this particular case, in only 3 months, we found that 170 blue check, so-called verified accounts in Meta, have published these 67,000 ads promoting fraud, impersonating media and celebrities, hacking into verified accounts, but also creating accounts that somehow got verified despite the users having absolutely nothing to do with the people they pretended to be. Footballers, media celebrities, singers, and when a platform has an ad system that can be gamed this easily, but also when the platform is actually telling their users, if you see a blue check by the name, you can trust this person is what they say they are, then you would expect to have a little more oversight. And this kind of ultra powerful tools that empower these actors and give them reach, those are kind of the incentives these people need to drive fraud at scale. So we talked about creator rewards or monetization in this case, and Victoire knows much more about this than I do. And then we have this investigation on ads. But if we move to the next slide, we can see that the incentives are sometimes even in the way these policies are written themselves and how they are selectively applied. To name a third platform in this case, this could be YouTube. This platform takes an approach that I like in writing to, for example, climate misinformation. They say, okay, you can actually push lies in my platform. You can say untrue things about climate. That is no problem. I kind of agree with that. I don't like removals of content. I like more like contextual interventions, like this fact-checking label saying, this is actually untrue. I rather like that. But they say what you cannot do is make money of climate lies. The problem is that they never seem to enforce those policies. So what we found was that just 20 high impact channels in Spanish. When I say high impact channels, is that these 20 channels alone had 21 million subscribers. So it's that substantial. They were making money of climate misinformation, despite the fact that the platform theoretically bans this. So they are earning money from this content against the platform rules. And the platform needs to know about this. And if they are going to have a rule, they need to enforce it. So going to my last slide, and I don't want to take too much of your time. What do we absolutely need? Accountability. Nothing ever has changed in my experience when dealing with these structures of power in the past, in history, but accountability. There is a good business here. Every time that I said that some of these bad actors were making money off platforms, let us not forget that the platform is also making money in every of these cases. So there is a financial incentive not to do more. So how do we get accountability? I have 3 broad ideas in the next slide, and that is the final. More transparency in many of these cases is next to impossible, and Victoire knows this very well. It's next to impossible to actually pinpoint who is making money. Sometimes we know some accounts or some users are capable of making money. Sometimes those users are telling us they are actually making money. But without the kind of data access that we would need, there is no way to study this in the depth that it should be studied. We need also in democratic societies more regulatory action. When there is 5 workers dead in a construction zone, safety inspectors show up at the construction place that day, and they don't leave until they understand what happened. And I think this needs to start happening on digital platforms. They cannot be, safety inspectors are working sites. They don't say, the companies cannot say, oh, our business is too complicated for you to know, to find out. No, what these public regulators do in construction areas, for example, is go there and say, okay, it might be too complicated, but you explain it to me, and you cannot operate this platform again until I am happy with the explanation and the measures you have put in place to prevent further damage from happening. And then, of course, we need more organized communities. This starts with all of us. Even as consumers or critical users of these platforms, we need to demand more. We need to raise our voices, and we need to, I would say, give credit to good actors. And with the power of our pockets and with our eyeballs, we need to also, I'm going to say, punish those that are not doing enough. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And again, we have many links to their incredible research in the resource document. Victoire, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lena. And it's really nice to see you all. Could I get the next slide, please? Great. So as Lena mentioned earlier, my name is Victoire Rio, and I lead an organization called What to Fix. And for the last 7 years or so, we've been looking at social media monetization practices. And I think, just to echo what Carlos said, this is really not a new phenomenon. It's something that we started observing in the context of Myanmar as far back as 2016. And it sort of coincided with the arrival of monetization services on Facebook as a platform. And I think some of you may have seen this, but we really saw a shift happen in 2016 where a lot more sort of clickbait content started to emerge. And a lot of it was driven by the arrival of monetization on Facebook as a platform. In Myanmar, it was very obvious, and it's something that we sort of took a while to understand. But in 2019, sort of looking back, we realized that a lot of the accounts that had been pushing a lot of anti-Rohingya content, especially, were actually earning from Facebook. Can I get to the next slide? But so what really has changed in the last few years? Well, I think one of the biggest shifts we've seen is the emergence of a lot of stakeholders that are operating transnationally. So what I have on the screen here are some research that recently came out from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism that has done a great series on how much of the anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim content in the UK is actually coming from stakeholders in Sri Lanka and in Pakistan that are predominantly motivated by money. And so this shift sort of towards having individuals that are in it purely for the money, that have absolutely no knowledge of the context, in some cases even the language, is relatively new. And it's something that we've seen sort of expand with more and more stakeholders. Can I get to the next slide? And so there's a couple of reasons that sort of drove this this shift. I think one that is really sort of a fundamental one has been the increased development in the automation space. So what you see here is a Vietnamese tool that is being used to manage thousands of accounts. And it doesn't just let you create fake accounts by the dozen, but it also allows you to manage them in an automated fashion. So you can group your accounts and get them to go and post content, generate AI-generated content, and post that content, engage with that content in order to kick off the recommender systems. So we've really seen sort of emergence of an industry of inauthentic automation that has been driven by this monetization features where people, because they want to make money, are developing, building different software, but they also investing in buying this software. So on the one hand, you've had sort of generative AI coming in that has allowed people to create content in languages that they don't necessarily speak. But you've also had automation that is designed to identify topics that are doing quite well, content that's doing quite well. So even before generative AI really kicked in, we had a huge problem in sort of 2019, 2020 with videos being identified as doing very well, being downloaded by some stakeholders and then reposted. And so we see sort of automation really sort of fuel a lot of this trend. But if you can move to the next slide. Next slide, please. Right. So I think that at the core of it all, though, it's not just the automation, it's not just generative AI that has led to this type of activity, but it's really the financial incentives, and that we've seen a major increase in the number of accounts that are benefiting from monetization programs. What you see here is a dashboard that we've been building for the last 7 years. We've been backing up Meta's disclosure about which accounts are part of their revenue redistribution program. And what we've seen is a significant increase, particularly over the last couple of years, and even more so really since the beginning of 2025. In January of 2025, there were about 2.5 million accounts that were monetizing from Meta. Today, we've just exceeded 15 million. And that's just Meta. Over the last couple of years, we've also seen X introduce a similar program. We've seen TikTok introduce similar programs. So it's now a model that we're seeing across platform. But I will encourage you to take a look at this transparency portal we put forward called monetization.wtf. I've got a QR code on the screen. But we have we've been trying to consolidate all the information we can find about what are the different programs across platform, but also what are the various accounts that have been part of Meta's programs on either Facebook or Instagram since 2019. And if you go through that list, there's over 16 million accounts now. You'll see that many of the accounts that you may be identifying through your research are actually part of those programs. I can get to the next slide. Right. So what do we need? Well, I will echo a lot of what Carlos just said, but I think one thing that is really critical is a stronger push towards monetization governance. For the last decade, maybe 15 years, we've been talking a lot about how platforms make decisions when it comes to content. And that's really important. But what we're seeing now is platforms are not just making content decisions, they're increasingly making financial decisions and monetization decisions. And we really need them to be more transparent about how they're making those decisions, what are their policies, and how they're enforcing these policies. What we find and what we found through our research is that there's a lot of policies that are there on paper and seem quite good and then are not being enforced at all. And we see this quite a lot. We did some research that showed that sanctioned entities were being approved into these programs. Some of our colleagues from Palestine identified a number of the problematic actors in the Israeli context also monetizing from Meta. So there's a lot of actors that are getting through and getting onboarded into this monetization programs, although the policies actually would normally prevent them from doing so. The second thing that I think is really important is to do with recommender systems. And there's been a lot of discussion recently around how we should shift or give people the possibility to have chronological feed. What I want to put on the table today is chronological feed are in and of themselves also gameable. And when we see the amount of automation that is at play, that is in itself not necessarily the solution. It's really important that we think about how do we prevent the use of automation to game a lot of those recommender systems. And the best way to do that is to demultiply the options and to let people set their own systems and then their own parameters so that it's actually not possible or much, much harder to use automation to trick and game those systems to get content to the top. And then finally, and this is the thing that really kind of scares me at the moment, and it's something that I'm particularly worried about in the Asian context, we've seen platforms onboard more and more stakeholders. We've seen more and more young people getting into the business of producing and posting content. But we're now starting to see platforms become stricter about their requirements and their onboarding. And we know that platforms are now actually moving towards producing their own content, their own AI-generated content. And once that happens, I think what we're going to see is a reduction in the number of accounts that they will be providing financing to. And what we are concerned about is what will happen to the million of individuals that have actually developed the technology, developed the know-how to do this kind of activity. And it's something that is going to be quite concerning, particularly in the Asian context where there are millions of accounts that are now monetized. When they stop making sufficient amount of money from the platforms, the risk is what will happen to this account? What will the stakeholders behind this account decide to do with the infrastructure that they have? And we are concerned about what this could mean for disinformation for hire initiatives. We're concerned about what this could mean for scam. And so really kind of wanted to put on the table as well that this idea that we need to start to think about how we're going to be disarming this activity and reducing this and making sure that all this infrastructure that platforms have been fundamentally engaged with and engaged in building doesn't make things worse moving forward. Can I get the final slide? Right. So I'm just going to leave you with one thing, is that this is fundamentally a tech accountability problem. Platforms are not just amplifying hate and division. In many cases, they are paying for it. And more often than not, they're actually the very reason some of the content actually exists. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you so much, Lena.
Thank you so much, Victoire. And both of you, again, I encourage you to go to the resource documents. You can read a whole lot more. There's an enormous amount of information that effectively reflects these investigations and how it's not actors that are part of that conflict dynamic that are profiting from the amplification of this content. I want to just give each of you a moment to answer this question, because you've done an excellent job in saying where the gaps are and what should be done. Is there any example where you see that some of this behavior has been curtailed, whether it's through, effective investigative journalism or highlighting the investigations that you've done, or is it in collaboration with the DSA or the OSA or the E-Commissioner, a more regulated environment? Is there anything you can point to that gives you a sign of like, we need more of that? Carlos, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm happy to. We have seen a few good examples, I would say, and they have normally come from regulatory action in my opinion. So there has been, for example, the part of the problems X is having at the EU level, at the European Union level, is mostly because these blue checks are deceptive, for example, and they tell you that you are talking to a particular person, and it's very often that you are not. So the only changes or provided, let's say, how do you say, remedy that I have seen, it goes in that direction. But I don't have many super hopeful examples in mind of things that have completely changed. It's more like incrementally in negotiation through litigation. I'm seeing some movement, but I would say we are still far from getting to a place where we are not only, I would say, safe, or these platforms are not heavily incentivizing this. I think even in the best of situations, we are still far from there.
Thank you. Victoire?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there has been success in tech accountability efforts. We saw quite a lot of progress in our advocacy in Myanmar, for example, on a number of issues. But when it comes to this particular issue, monetization, it's something where we found platforms to be very reticent to do anything. And I think this is really one of those spaces in which regulation is required. The general sense is everybody else is doing it. And so long as everybody else is doing it, why shouldn't we? And I think that's very much why, for example, I started What to Fix as a European organization to look at how regulation could be used and leveraged in this particular context. I don't think we are there yet in many ways, but I think one of the things we've been trying to point out is when it comes to monetization services and when it comes to payments, there's a lot of existing laws and regulations that apply. And in many ways, many of these laws and regulations appear to be already violated. The problem is that there is no transparency. So these laws are not being enforced. And I think this is where Europe can maybe do a service to the rest of the world, is in really pushing for more transparency about this particular services. So as I mentioned earlier, we have released a transparency portal called monetization.wtf, and that's our attempt at bringing more transparency to the space. But what we're really pushing for from a regulatory perspective is for this kind of transparency to be made available by the platforms themselves. At the moment, Meta is the only platform that provides any kind of visibility on the accounts that are benefiting from its monetization services. And that transparency is not comprehensive at all. In fact, what you can see from Meta is a list of the accounts that are monetized today. That's useful, but it doesn't allow you to do much in terms of research, which is why we've been backing those disclosures. We've been backing those up for the last 7 years so that we can have this history. But fundamentally, we can't be responsible as a small nonprofit for backstopping transparency for the entire world. And so we're really, I think this is where regulation really can kick in, is in pushing for this transparency to happen at the level of the platforms themselves.
Thank you. And one of the reports that What to Fix produced recently was looking at the risk assessments. That's one of the obligations of the big companies towards the DSA, and asking, do they talk about monetization as part of their risk assessment? And you can guess that the answer was not in a satisfactory way. So really important work that both of you are doing. So grateful that you made time to be with us today. And to all of those joining us, please take a look at the resources of these two organizations. And thank you again. On to the next session. Thank you. Bye-bye.